Hi, so welcome to this webinar on leadership derailers and risks, tackling them before it's too late. My name is James Brook and I'm founder and MD of Plexus Leadership. At Plexus, what we do is we develop positive leaders and thriving workplaces for breakthrough performance and a more sustainable world. So in this very challenging world with this COVID-19 crisis, what's really important, we feel, is to develop more positive leaders who can deal with these crises and create a more sustainable business and thriving workplaces. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute you all to ensure there's no background noise, and at the end we're going to have time for questions. So you can also ask your questions, by the way, using the Q&A or the chat box, and I can take those as we go along. But given that we haven't got that many people on the call today, what we can do is probably just have the Q&A at the end, and I can unmute you. So I've been fascinated by leadership risks and derailers for several decades now as a leadership consultant and a coach. And I've served in different internal roles, like I was head of Yahoo Talent during the heyday of Yahoo. But also I've been running my own businesses for the last 15 odd years. And I think based on all my experience that it's very difficult to help leaders reach their full potential unless you can help them spot and overcome blockers and limiters, as well as enabling them to optimize their strengths. So I'm really hoping that this primer is going to enable you to take away some practical insights to help your leaders to discover and mitigate their limiters and their risk areas. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on these 4 areas. First of all, we're going to start with understanding the latest research into derailers. Then we're going to move on to spotting the most problematic derailers and risks. And then we're going to talk about specific ways, concrete ways to prevent and reduce some of the risk factors. Before we get into these main points, I just want to spend a little bit of time defining what we mean by derailers and risks. So leadership derailers are really factors that cause leaders to fall short of expectations or to fail. And they typically plateau leaders or cause the leaders to leave the business altogether. Performance risks, on the other hand, are weaknesses that the leaders have, but also they might be overdone strengths. And we're going to spend a bit of time unpacking that concept of overdone strengths. But also, of course, psychological barriers and blockers, particularly in relation to issues relating to leaders' mindsets. I think it's important to note before we continue that derailment doesn't necessarily end a leader's career. The leader, of course, can move on to a different job and succeed in a different organization. But there's significant costs, both direct costs, such as rehiring costs, onboarding costs, but also indirect costs, such as reputational damage and loss of staff morale that can occur because of leadership derailers and risk areas. So it's important to understand and manage leadership derailers and risks for a variety of reasons. And some of the most important reasons are, of course, to build a strong succession pipeline comprising some of the best candidates. So you can understand how leaders will respond in times of pressure and crisis. Of course, to help leaders understand and mitigate their own blockers and barriers so they can manage them better. So to improve, in other words, self-management, to improve business performance, to create a more positive, thriving workplace where leaders can multiply rather than diminish people's energy and talents. And then also, of course, to improve top team performance, ensuring that top team is fit to deal with future challenges. And as we have seen during the COVID crisis, poor leadership is very tough to hide in difficult times and challenging times, and it can be extremely damaging. We need to understand not only how leaders will behave during the best of times, but of course also under pressure, because you've got a significant number now of disruptive forces that are impacting businesses. and those disruptive forces are only going to grow in magnitude. So we've got things like the pressure on leaders to do much more with less. We've got digital transformation. We've got some of the climate challenges that we're seeing. And of course, we've got those black swan disruptive forces like the COVID crisis that we can't predict very well, or in fact, we can't predict at all. So it's a very uncertain, turbulent environment that leaders are having to manage, having to deal with. And that's going to make these limiters and risks all the more apparent. So this is an interesting slide because it shows that research over the last few decades on CEO tenure, and what it's showing, what you can see in the graph, is that CEO tenure, or obviously time in role, is declining steadily during recent decades in the industrialized world, including the UK. And there's a variety of drivers of that. And one of the drivers, of course, is that CEOs are being required to operate in increasingly challenging times, as we've already said, but also they've been required to do a lot more. So the standards against which they've been measured are becoming increasingly challenging and difficult. So the bar's continuously being raised. And some of these factors that we're seeing are that they're having to not only look after now things like revenue performance, earnings performance, the stock, obviously price increases and so on, M&A success, so merger and acquisition success, but they're also being measured against things now like ESG performance. And of course, ESG performance is becoming increasingly important and is on most leaders' radars now. So ESG performance is environmental, social, and governance performance. And some of the big investment trusts that invest in companies are insisting that boards and excos focus on ESG metrics and performance and improve in those areas. Then we've got D&I, diversity and inclusion, increasingly again, boards and institutions like investment trusts and big pension funds and so on are acquiring organizations increasingly, especially if they're public listed organizations, to focus on these issues as well, and to ensure a more balanced workforce, a more diverse workforce. And then, of course, we know that a lot of boards are very concerned about ethics and integrity and leadership behaviors. So this is also becoming an issue that's getting increased prominence in recent years. So the pressures on CEOs and leaders in general are growing as leaders face increasing headwinds. So of course, leaders need to be stronger and much better equipped to deal with these, to understand these and to deal with them. So if we look at some of the research into the key derailment factors, essentially what I've done here is I've summarized the research for you. And this is decades worth of research by all sorts of significant organizations in the leadership development area, both academic organizations, but also practitioner-based organizations and consulting firms. And we can see that derailers and performance risks typically fall into four main categories. The first is what we call self-management capabilities. So things like failing to learn quickly, resistance to change, things like managing your energy and time. These are what we refer to as self-management capabilities. The second area are interpersonal capabilities. So those are obviously things like how you relate to others, being sensitive to their needs. Of course, some leaders are insensitive. Some leaders may come across as cold and aloof, and that might limit their career. Some leaders might come across as too aggressive. So that's what we mean by interpersonal capabilities. The third area is what we call business capabilities. So these include performance problems, lack of hard work, lack of strategic foresight, not being sufficiently business savvy in terms of some of the future forces shaping the business and so forth. And then finally, we've got leadership capabilities, which include things like failing to hire effectively, the inability to delegate, the inability to deal with tough performance issues, which is a very common one in my experience. Some of these derailers, these capabilities relate to more observable skills and behaviors, whilst others are much deeper, much more persistent. And they stem from the leader's personality, the leader's values and beliefs. What I've done for you is I've provided a summary on the right-hand side of the top 7 derailers based on decades of research and my own experience working with leaders over around 25 years now. And you can see there that, and some of these you might expect, others may be a bit of a surprise for you, but things like mindset blockers, the overuse or poor use of strengths is a very, very common source of derailment, which we're going to get into in a bit more detail. Resisting learning and adaptation. Obviously, leaders have to be incredibly agile and have to adapt their style, their approach, their teams as well to meet those new challenges. Relationship problems we've already talked about, inability to build a strong team and to deploy that team effectively and quickly to achieve organizational results. We've seen quite a few high-profile cases, including the CEO of Santander, for example, who's burnt out because of poor energy management. And then, of course, cultural mismatch, when there's a lack of fit between the personality that's brought in a leadership role and what the organization actually needs for the current situation and the future. So these are some of the things that we commonly find and are identified in the research. I just want to talk a little bit about one of these deeper areas that can derail leaders, or some of these deeper areas. And we've got a whole variety of maladaptive tendencies. And I'm not sure whether any of you have heard about the dark triad factors, but this is getting increasing attention amongst researchers, and it's really important to understand these dark triad factors. When we talk about the dark triad factors, we're talking about Machiavellianism, which is basically referring to leaders being manipulative, cold, and indifferent. And narcissism, which is about leaders having an excessively strong ego, sense of self-importance, and being very attention-seeking and also lacking in empathy. And I'm sure many of you know leaders who can be like this on occasion, or maybe all the time. And if you don't know them personally, you might be able to see them in the press or from following the news and so on. And then the last of the dark triad factors is psychopathy, including antisocial behavior. So leaders who lack empathy, they've got a real inability to connect and love other people and build meaningful relationships. And so these dark triad factors are really important because not only has there been research showing how they can derail leaders, but also there's been a lot of research which suggests that actually they positively related to higher hierarchical and financial achievement amongst leaders, which is really interesting to note. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Suffice it to say that it's really important to be able to spot these, to identify them, to understand them. And of course, these can be incredibly limiting and even cause the downfall of a company. So for example, Enron, the energy and commodities trading company, was really led astray by executives really high on the dark triad traits. And they became very self-serving, they became very manipulative, lacked empathy, and lacked integrity, and really drove the organization into its eventual downfall and bankruptcy. So these are things that we should pay attention to. But as I say, before we stray into the darkness forever, let's move on and focus on other derailment factors. So one of the common causes of derailment is arrogance. This is very common in my experience. And arrogance is less of a personality trait, more of a mindset. And we're going to talk a little bit more about mindsets and how mindsets can be very significant factors in derailing executives. So mindsets are really, as you can see on the slide, the set of attitudes and beliefs that shape leaders' thoughts and actions. And many of you would have come across the work of Stanford professor and psychologist Dr. Carol Dweck, who made a distinction between the fixed and growth mindsets. And she did a lot of research to support this, which is ongoing research. Just to expand on that, for those of you who haven't come across her work, and it's definitely worthwhile checking out, essentially a fixed mindset person believes intelligence is fixed and can't be changed, whereas a growth mindset leader believes that they can continue to learn and grow. They believe that potential is infinite, and they, if they put in a lot of time and effort into their learning, they can develop their behaviors and skill areas and so on. I've done quite a lot of work around building on that work and developed several frameworks. And one of these you can see on the slide in front of you, which identifies 4 pillars of mindset. And of course, a leader is defined by what they choose to focus on. So these 4 pillars are around their purpose, their problem-solving approach, their interpersonal style, and their learning approach. And leaders can either be in that upper zone, for example, in terms of problem-solving approach. They can take a fact-based and solution-oriented approach, or they can take a very emotional and reactive approach. Similarly, in relation to their learning, they can be agile and curious, or they can have a very fixed and resistant mindset. And the good news about mindset is that leaders can actually shift their mindsets, and they can shift their mindsets relatively quickly if they understand the implications of holding a limiting mindset. Leaders are generally very smart people. I've worked with a lot of leaders to help them shift their mindsets through using things like CBT approaches and cognitive behavioral approaches. And leaders, once, as I say, they understand the implications of holding limiting mindsets, they generally look to move forward and change those. So I think we all need to help leaders understand where they are along those kind of 4 continuums, and that can result in enormous performance gains when they become unblocked and shift their beliefs and attitudes and choose to focus on a different, I suppose, more kind of positive approach. So we've talked a little bit about mindsets. Let's talk a little bit about one of the biggest risks that I see for leaders. And it's interesting because all my work over decades with leaders around strengths suggests that many leaders really don't understand what happens when their strengths are overplayed, when they go into the overdrive zone. I would suggest that only about 5 to 10% of leaders are aware of the overdrive risks. So overdrive occurs when leaders unintentionally use their strengths too much or in the wrong way, and that leads to negative outcomes. So for example, I'll just give you a few examples of this. A courageous leader can come across as overly direct or reckless, or a decisive leader can present in an overly hasty, rash, or pushy way. You might get a very detail-oriented leader who's very conscientious as well, and they might become overly perfectionistic. Overdrive is caused by a whole variety of factors, both internal to the leader, but also external factors. The common trigger that we see is stress and pressure, but it's not the only one. Poor awareness and lack of feedback is also a very common cause of overdrive behaviors, as quite frankly is cultures, organizational cultures that reinforce overdrive behaviors. So for example, you might get a culture which is all about execution, results, getting things done. And that can really accentuate, amplify overdrive behaviors. Just a final note about overdrive. The same effect can occur in teams and organizations. So we generally see, working with excos, working with C-suites, we generally see that the tendencies, the excesses, if you want, the lopsidedness in the teams are reflected deeper in the organization, in other teams further down the organization, and sometimes in the whole culture itself. And we've worked with very big organizations. These are national organizations that have a lopsidedness to them. And so helping them to uncover those and helping them to address those is really important, because it could actually take them off in a direction that's actually quite limiting for the company as a whole in terms of their performance outcomes, their revenue targets, their share price, and so on. And we discussed an extreme example of that in Enron, but there's a lot of other examples that I can provide that will probably come to mind for you. We were working, for example, with a major national retailer that was very kind of execution oriented, very results driven, making lots of new acquisitions, expanding very quickly, but really losing sight of the customers and losing sight of the human aspects of transactions around building strong customer loyalty, building strong customer relationships, empathic interactions, and so on. And they've changed that now and are moving off in a very different direction and are doing much better as a result. So, so as I say, it's very powerful to understand those overdrive tendencies at organizational levels as well as individual levels. So how do we actually help our organizations and our leaders to reduce derailers and risks? And of course, the start point is good awareness. And good awareness can be achieved using high quality balanced feedback. Things like 360 surveys are very powerful. Psychometrics are very powerful. So psychometrics to help them understand their strengths, like StrengthsFinder or StrengthsScope. Psychometrics which will help them understand their personality, like a Hogan, and some of the dark side, although I don't like that term. I think that term can be reframed to performance risks. So yeah, but certainly those sorts of tools can be really helpful to help leaders understand not just their personality and their strengths, but also some of the limiters and the risks that they face. And I help organizations typically to incorporate an evaluation of risks into things like their talent review and their succession process. But I rarely see this done by organizations without external consulting support. So that's something I think just to make a note of, that if you're going to do a talent review, if you're going to do a whole kind of succession process, planning process, it's really important to take account of risks as well. Next, it's very important to ensure effective leader onboarding and development, including a dialogue around potential overdrive risks and other risks picked up during the hiring process. Often we take leaders through a robust assessment process, whether it's just an interview or alternatively an interview plus an assessment center type experience. But we don't actually provide them with that feedback, and we don't spend time with them to help them understand the feedback and the implications of that feedback. Of course, coaching and mentoring is really important to help leaders to tackle the risks before they become bigger issues, especially when you've got more pronounced, more extreme risks that they face. But of course, sometimes coaching and mentoring is not going to be enough. Performance dialogues are not going to be enough, and we're going to have to take tough action, particularly in the case of, for example, some of those dark triad tendencies and factors where the costs to the business from keeping the person simply become too great. And we would recommend in those cases that you know that you work with the CEO or somebody at the top of the organization to take swift action, rather than trying too hard to change such a deeply rooted personality trait. It's going to be extremely difficult to change. Or even worse, what I see a lot with HR sometimes and talent management teams is they'll just ignore the problem and hope it goes away. And of course, it doesn't go away. It just gets worse and undermines the team and the business ultimately. Finally, risk can be prevented or mitigated by building agility amongst leaders. There's lots of different ways to do that, including building a learning culture where leaders are expected to demonstrate curiosity and learning. And really that needs to be led from the top. That needs to be led by the CEO and other leaders, because otherwise it doesn't become a part of the cultural DNA. And a great example of that is actually Microsoft, if you want examples, who very explicitly and actively encourage a growth mindset throughout the organization. Leaders can be given novel and, of course, and diverse challenges to test their strengths and capabilities. And it's really important as part of a talent review succession process, again, that you don't just identify key people, you don't just identify key roles, but you also identify key challenges that some of these leaders can take on, the ones that have the potential to advance. So that's another way that you can test out the leader in different situations, in challenging situations outside their comfort zone, to see what risks surface. And then obviously you can provide feedback and help them tackle those risks through coaching and mentoring and good development support, development programs and things like that. So we're almost at the end now. I just want to give you time to ask questions. So because there's only a few of you, I'm actually going to just unmute you all so you can come in and ask your questions or provide comments. So let me just unmute you. So I think we've got, right, any questions at this point? Hello?
Hi, no questions from me. Thank you, James.
That was Seema, right? No
Yes.
Questions from Seema? Okay. Any comments, Seema?
No, useful presentation and reminders of best practice, and in terms of some of the derailers, which I think will become more apparent during these coming times.
Great, yes. Times of crisis tend to bring these things out, don't they?
Yes.
So any other thoughts?
Hello, James. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Is it Tolu?
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for a great webinar tackling all the various aspects. I was gonna ask us about the fact that you said there was this leader who was on the path to derailment, but then went on. You said it doesn't necessarily end the career of the executive. They can move on to other positions and become great. I was curious to, was it the cultural environment of the new place? What do you account for the change in behavior that could make somebody who was on the way to derailment then go on to become great somewhere else?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Tolu, and often it relates to cultural fit. You know, we talked about the mismatch between the leader's personality. It's not always just personality. Sometimes it's personality and aspirations and values as well. And so if there's a mismatch, then often a leader will get frustrated, they'll get demotivated, they'll get de-energized, because they really can't achieve their purpose, their specific aspirations, and therefore they might not perform well or be blocked by the culture from performing well, and quite frankly be unwilling to adapt to that culture. And then they can move to another organization and they can thrive in that organization. And where I see it quite frequently actually is people who are very entrepreneurial and they join big corporations, particularly in this day and age where a lot of the big organizations are recruiting from some of the smaller successful entrepreneurial organizations, or alternatively they're bringing in leaders through acquisition. And those entrepreneurially oriented leaders don't necessarily work particularly well and don't want to adapt to the bigger corporate processes and hierarchy and red tape and so on. So that's a good example of where they might become very frustrated, demotivated, and go and work for another entrepreneurial organization and be incredibly successful.
Thank you. That's quite insightful too. Does Tina have some questions? So I'm not dominating this conversation.
No, Tolu, please go ahead. I don't have any other questions at this point. Thank you.
Have you got another question, Tolu? Hello, Tolu? Okay, well, what I'm going to do is if there's no more questions, then I'll end the webinar. Thank you so much for attending. And clearly we've had a few problems in terms of the link that was sent out. So we'll make sure that for the next webinar, everyone's got that link. But thank you for attending. And we will send you, by the way, not just the slides for the webinar today, but we'll also send you a few articles on derailment, which hopefully will be valuable. So thank you very much, and you all stay safe and take care during the lockdown.
Thank you so much, James. That was very useful. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.